Hello everyone, welcome to this video, which is an update on the Splines system that I've been working on for the Stride game engine. I've put this project on hold at least 6 to 7 months to give priority on the C# intermediate project. I thought I'd continue working on this to see where I would end up. So as you can see, I've started a project which is a sample project that I use to demonstrate various spline functionality. And right now I have the main scene loaded, which is just 2 splines that I've positioned inside my level or my world. And here when we start our game, a spline debug or spline render is actually being shown, and that works pretty nice. This is all created inside the editor. I will show that in a second. And if I go to scene number 2, we have a spline that is created entirely by code. You can see its bounding boxes as well. We can disable that, and every time I press space, we get a new spline with random positions and tangents to just yank at those control points. I can also disable looping, and we get these cool looking splines. Then something that I've been working on today, that is the Spline Traverser, and I had a lot of prototyping code already in place, but I finally had the time to fix this right up. So a Spline Traverser, if we switch to that scene, we can have objects that traverse the spline, and as you can see, we can go in a forward or backward direction, and this all depends on the speed that is set to the Spline Traverser. And pretty much any entity in your scene can have a Spline Traverser component which references a spline, and then we can just travel along this spline. And even if the object is far away from the spline or not on the spline, it will move towards that spline, its closest position, and then just start following it or traversing it. So we can do the exact same thing, of course, by code. This spline is not created inside the editor, but through code. As you can see, I've set the amount of segments quite low. And if I press space, I start toggling the move on this spline, and I can also adjust the speed with the mouse wheel. So now it starts following this spline, and I can increase this speed. One thing that's wrong at this particular, well, code or algorithm is that if the speed is high enough, then we get this sort of jitter around all of the nodes. There are ways to fix that, but I'm not too worried about that because it's quite uncommon to have such high velocity on such a spline. And if that's really happening, then you can just either decrease the segments or place these splines further away from each other. But like I said, I can also just go backwards. I can do that real time, so no jitter among those objects. Then another really cool thing with Spline Traversers is the usage of Spline Traverser events. Let me go into the editor real quick before we continue on this. Oh wait, let me just show the spline closest point first. That's the final demo scene. I've already shown this before. If you move around this, you can move around this object, and then there's this custom script, which is just one method to get the closest point on a spline, and that's this red orb is representing that. But let's go to that Spline Traverser events demo scene. So I have that here. As you can see, I have all these orbs here. These are the tangents to control every spline node. I spend a lot of time creating custom transformations so that you have multiple transforms to edit inside your editor, but I just couldn't get it to work properly. So I'll just wait for someone to make that, and then I can update it later on. So for now, we'll just have to use these custom, well, vector3 inputs. And luckily I can disable these spline nodes so that you don't see them. That clears up the view just a little bit. And as we've seen before, if I would select a spline, then it exists, or it has this option to loop, which we have for the left spline. It exists out of the a reference to the spline nodes, which in this case are children, and each node has a spline node component to set the segments. And then we also have this spline renderer, where we determine whether we want to see the spline in the first place, and also if we want to see its bounding boxes. And then we can set a custom material for these spline renderers as well. So that's kind of cool, I think. So for the spline code, or for the events, I've set up two particle systems. They're disabled. And if I enable them, you can see if I reach a node, then I want to, well, activate this this red particle system. And if I've reached the end, or the last node in my spline loop, then I want to enable this green spline, or a particle emitter. And if I just pick up my code, just to give you some example, here we have some code for the Spline Traverser demo, which is a simple startup script. It references the Spline Traverser component. And as you can see, this Spline Traverser component, it has two events: on spline end and on spline node reached. And that simply triggers a little cool event. It duplicates the one of the particle emitters, and it just adds them as a child to the moving object, our Spline Traverser. So one thing that is a little bit odd with the Spline Traversers, on one hand, it's really cool that they can move inside the editor. If I set moving to false, then, or a true, they will actually start following the object inside the editor. Funny thing is, if I start to play, then they will not play from the position where they are currently at, but they use the position where they started moving. So that's kind of cool. It's kind of a bonus, really, but it's more of a bug than really a feature. That is something that I might change, just like with the emitters, where they have this editor control option here, which should be different than the actual gameplay control. But for now, this works kind of cool. What was I saying? Oh, this is moving inside the editor, and it's kind of cool. And here we've set up the events that should happen for both of these objects. So once the green orb here reaches the end of this spline, it should fire off a green particle emitter. So here we are. If I press 5, we start loading it. And here's the red one for a node reached. And here you can see the green one because the target has been reached, or the end of the spline in this case for the spline that's not looping. And here's a spline node. That's the third one in this particular spline on the left. If that is being reached, then we trigger that event as well. I'm sure that that's kind of useful for sounds, particle effects, or other kind of triggers. I'm sure that you can make all kinds of cool use cases with that. So that's what we've got so far. One of the last things that I might ponder working on is rotational movement for the spline traversers, because right now it's just positional movement. That also means physics movement is not supported yet. Maybe that should not be too difficult to do if I just enable the is kinematic option on rigid bodies, just like what you would do with moving platforms. That should work somewhat similar, so it should not be too difficult to do that. But it's not something on the list for the first pull request. The other prototype components, like the spline decorator and the spline mesh generator for creating roads or custom models or rain gutters or anything in those lines, that is something on the to-do list as well. Okay, well that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.